Welcome to this explainer on the 1994-95 Major League Baseball strike. Today, we're going to unpack how a deeply flawed legal framework, combined with decades of bitter distrust, essentially triggered a ticking time bomb. We're talking about the absolute most catastrophic work stoppage in the history of North American professional sports. It's wild, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this with a number. 0. That is exactly how many World Series games were played in 1994. Now, to put that into perspective, for 90 years, through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, you name it, the Fall Classic was a constant. Literally, the last time a World Series hadn't been played was way back in 1904. But in 94, the stadiums just went completely dark. So to understand how something that unthinkable actually went down, we really have to look backward at the frankly bizarre legal foundation that baseball was built upon.
The absolute bedrock of this whole conflict is something called the reserve clause. For decades, once a player signed with a team, that team essentially owned the rights to that player in perpetuity. Forever, until they were traded or released. It completely wiped out any chance of free market movement and allowed owners to artificially suppress player salaries. It was basically cartel behavior that absolutely wouldn't fly in any other industry, right? And because of this, it fostered a deep systemic distrust between the owners, who basically held all the cards, and the players who were bound to them. But you might be wondering, how on earth was this even legal?
Well, let's move to and see how this builds, because this legal anomaly was actually backed straight up to the highest court in the land. Back in 1922, the Supreme Court ruled in the federal baseball case that baseball exhibitions were just local affairs, meaning the sport was somehow magically exempt from federal antitrust laws. And incredibly, the court upheld this exemption again in 1953 with the Toulson decision, and yet again in 1972 against Curt Flood. By exempting baseball from normal interstate commerce rules, the courts basically provided a long-burning fuse. MLB was totally isolated from the legal realities that literally every other business faced, which allowed owner dominance and labor hostilities to just compound for generations.
So fast forward to 1994. The collective bargaining agreement was expiring, and these two warring factions were deeply entrenched. Let's look at their motivations here, completely impartially. The owners were citing a worsening financial situation, insisting that small market clubs would just collapse without a salary cap tied to a new revenue-sharing plan. They wanted to guarantee competitive equity. Now, the players, on the other hand, adamantly opposed any artificial cap on their earnings. They had fought tooth and nail for free market rights, and they were still carrying the fresh scars of the 1980s, a time when owners were repeatedly found guilty of colluding to keep salaries down. So as you can imagine, the trust was entirely broken.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it shows the very core of this business dispute. Owner Representative Richard Ravitch unveiled a model that proposed guaranteeing a record $1 billion in salary and benefits. But there was a catch. It forced clubs into a strictly even payroll structure. This meant eliminating salary arbitration and totally changing the rules of free agency. The Players Union, led by Donald Fair, looked at this proposed model and just firmly rejected it. To them, the salary cap was nothing more than a mechanism for owners to fix their own financial mismanagement, entirely at the players' expense.
And then the fuse finally ran out. On August 12, 1994, the players walked off the job. The games literally just stopped. After weeks of federal mediation produced absolutely zero progress, Acting Commissioner Bud Selig stepped to the podium on September 14th and did the unthinkable. He formally canceled the remainder of the 1994 season, and that included the postseason and the World Series. The time bomb had officially detonated, tearing what Selig himself called an irreparable hole in the game's fabric. The immediate fallout from this was absolutely staggering. 948. That is the total number of games just vaporized from the schedule. And this wasn't just a loss of entertainment, folks. The economic devastation was massive. The cancellation meant an estimated $580 million in lost revenue for ownership. And for the players, well, they collectively lost roughly $230 million in salaries. Both sides essentially decided they would rather bleed money than concede a single inch of ground.
But beyond the crazy balance sheets, there was an immense human and emotional toll to this strike. Seattle Mariners superstar Ken Griffey Jr. summed up the heartbreak perfectly. At the exact moment the strike hit, Griffey was having an absolutely electrifying season. He was leading the American League with 40 home runs. He was on a historic pace. And then suddenly, he was just sitting at home.
And Griffey definitely wasn't alone. Just listen to the sheer frustration in this quote from the Chicago White Sox Frank Thomas.
He was the reigning American League MVP, and he'd actually go on to win it again for '94. Think about it. To be an elite athlete, to train your entire life to peak, to finally hit that absolute career pinnacle, only to have the rug completely pulled out from under you by a boardroom labor dispute, it was just devastating for these competitors.
And as fans, we were robbed of witnessing some of the greatest record chases in baseball history. Tony Gwynn was batting an astronomical .394, seriously threatening to become the first player since Ted Williams in 1941 to hit .400. Matt Williams of the Giants was halted at 43 home runs, on a very legitimate pace to break Roger Maris's legendary single-season record. And then there was Don Mattingly. The beloved Yankees captain had played 13 seasons without a single playoff appearance. In 1994, his Yankees had the best record in the American League, and the strike just stole his chance at October glory. Now, the strike also created some incredibly bizarre, kind of darkly comedic situations, mostly because all normal league operations were completely frozen. Take future Hall of Famer Dave Winfield, for example. The Minnesota Twins traded him to the Cleveland Indians for a player to be named later. But because the season was abruptly canceled, no actual player transactions could be completed. So to settle the books, executives from Cleveland and Minnesota literally just went out for a meal, and Cleveland picked up the tab. Yeah, a legendary player was effectively traded for a dinner. As 1995 rolled around with no deal in sight, owners resorted to their ultimate leverage, replacement players. And the chaos that followed in spring training was unprecedented. The province of Ontario actually had labor laws prohibiting replacement workers, so the Toronto Blue Jays were legally banned from playing in their own stadium and had to relocate all the way to Florida. Baltimore Orioles owner Peter Angelis flat out refused to field a replacement team. And legendary Detroit Tigers manager Sparky Anderson, he was forced into an involuntary leave of absence because he absolutely refused to manage scab players. The sport was literally fracturing at every single level. So the crucial point is this standoff didn't actually break at the bargaining table. It took the heavy hand of the federal government. On April 2, 1995, right before the season was about to start with replacement players, U.S. District Court Judge and future Supreme Court Justice, by the way, Sonia Sotomayor, issued a preliminary injunction against the owners. She ruled they had illegally attempted to eliminate free agency and salary arbitration. This legal move forced both sides back to work under the terms of the expired agreement, officially ending the 232-day strike. Baseball was finally back, but man, the fans were utterly furious. In past strikes, fans usually blamed either the greedy owners or the greedy players, but this time, they despised both. At Shea Stadium, fans threw $160 in $1 bills right onto the field to mock the greed. Over in Cincinnati, a fan hired a plane to fly a banner reading, "Owners and players, to hell with all of you." And in Detroit, fans pelted the field with beer bottles, lighters, and, remarkably, an actual hubcap. The romance of the game had been completely shattered.
And this brilliantly illustrates the measurable cost of breaking the public's trust, which was immediate. In 1994, before the strike, average attendance was robust at over 31,000 fans per game. But by 1995, that number plummeted to about 25,000. That is an immediate 20% drop in attendance. Television ratings similarly cratered. The fans basically voted with their wallets, turning their backs on a sport that had just turned its back on them.
But perhaps the most tragic, lasting legacy of the 1994 strike belongs to the Montreal Expos. At the time of the walkout, the Expos were an absolute juggernaut. They held the best record in all of baseball at 74-40, despite having one of the lowest payrolls. They were heavy World Series favorites, but the strike completely devastated the franchise financially. By the spring of 1995, they were forced into a total fire sale, trading away their brilliant young core, stars like Marquise Grissom, Ken Hill, Larry Walker, and John Wetland. The franchise never truly recovered its fan base or its magic, a downfall that eventually forced their relocation to Washington, D.C. a decade later.
Which brings us to today. The ghosts of 1994 definitely still linger over the sport's economic structure. Now, MLB didn't even attempt another salary cap discussion for decades, but the underlying tensions regarding revenue sharing and player compensation, those never truly disappear. With the current collective bargaining agreement set to expire in 2026, we have to ask ourselves, has the sport truly evolved its labor relations to prevent another catastrophe? Or are we just watching another long fuse, slowly burning towards zero? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep your eye on the business behind the game.